My ex-boyfriend, 30M, and I, 26F, dated for just shy of a year and I broke up with him about a month ago. Ending the relationship was the right decision and I have no lingering feelings towards him, though I do have a lot of respect for him. We haven't spoken since our relationship ended. My lease is coming due this month and I found a beautiful flat that I am planning on signing on to this week. I will move in at the end of June. The only issue is that this flat is 2 blocks from my ex-partner's house. We are both active people and I think it's more than likely that we will run into each other not infrequently in this neighborhood. Should I give him a heads up next month that I'm moving into the neighborhood? I don't want to catch him by surprise. TLDR. I'm, 26F, moving into a flat that's 2 blocks away from my ex-partner's, 30M, house. Should I let him know that I'm moving into his neighborhood? If you are still on speaking terms I would say yes, but since you're not, I don't see the need. If, when you run into him, you can tell him. This makes a lot of sense, thanks. No. What would he do with that info? Move. If you bump into him, tell him then. But I'd leave him alone otherwise. This is a fair point. I thought letting him know would be helpful so that he wouldn't be caught off guard if we ran into each other, but perhaps reaching out, after being no contact, would do more harm than good. Thanks for your insight. I live 4 blocks away from my toxic ex in a small town. Haven't seen him in years. It's awesome. I lived 3 to 4 blocks away from my ex. He knew and we avoided each other's streets. I managed to only see him twice from a distance over the course of a year. One time BCI walked down his street thinking there was 0 chance he would be home. I was wrong. I wouldn't tell him but out of respect try to avoid his block. Other places he frequents in the neighborhood that you have little to no interest in going to, i.e. a specific bar or restaurant that you know he loves but you don't go to often, edit. Don't go out of your way to avoid him. Just if it's easy and you have other options, might be best to utilize them. Good idea, thanks. I both live in the same apartment complex and work at the same place as a colleague. We almost never cross paths at home. I think you'll be okay if you don't let him know. Congrats on your new place. I have neighbors in my apartment building of 3 years that I never even saw before in my life until we had a fire alarm evacuation at 1 a.m. No. It sounds as if you want to reconnect. Definitely don't want to reconnect, but yes, I can see how it could come across that way if I were to reach out. Thanks. Lol. I lived up the road from my boyfriend for a year, across from a tea shop he frequented a lot. And we never once crossed paths. We met after I moved away. Cold sweat smile. I think you'll be fine. No sense creating issues where they may not exist. If you run into him, deal with it then. This is great, because I would be the guy in this situation. Hell, same ages too. Regardless, don't tell him. My ex, of 3.5y, moved broadly in the same area, probably 5 to 10 blocks in any direction, that I am in after she left me back in Feb. I don't know exactly where and honestly, I don't really want to know. While I still wince at the sight of every car that looks like hers, the area I live in is still big enough that if I did see it or her, I could easily lose her in traffic or a crowd. I am still horribly heartbroken over my ex, but between me and my therapist the right thing was to not allow my ex to push me out of town. I still go about my business and enjoyment of town and what it has to offer regardless if I will run into her and her new BF. Your ex-BF will need to learn to live his life, go about his business and enjoyment. Whether or not you are there, he cannot control what you do. I cannot control what my ex-GF will do, so I continue to go about my business. It's been nearly 3 months and I haven't seen her once. Thank you for sharing your experience. Very helpful to hear. I would not reach out. Randomly running into each other is one thing, but affirmatively contacting him to let him know you're moving nearby is kind of weird and presumptuous. If an ex told me he was moving nearby, I would be on high alert and anxious every time I went out in my neighborhood. Don't put him in that position, just deal with it when you run into each other. Very helpful to hear, thanks. The last thing I want to do is to make it more uncomfortable for him. No message it is. If you bump into him, you say you moved there. I don't think he needs a heads up about it. He's your ex, you don't have to tell him anything. Nah, you don't owe him. Enjoy your new place. I think you're overestimating how often you'll run into him. If you guys were still chatting from time to time, then it would be reasonable to mention it, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Honestly, I don't think this is a big deal either way, but personally I think it would be more awkward to craft a message if you're not looking to restart contact with him. If you wind up running into him and he has an issue with it, that's really not your problem. No, don't do it. Just live your life, and if you guys bump into each other, then leave it at that. No, he's not PO or the welcome wagon, who cares? Live life. You probably might never even run into him. Don't tell anything unless you truly want him to know. I live in an apartment building with hundreds of neighbors, and I can count on one finger the number of times I bump into them at the local store, park, coffeehouse, gym. I wouldn't say anything. You both have your lives to live. Even if you run into him, so what? You're not obligated to tell him. If he's an adult, then it shouldn't be a problem. Watch out for rekindling moments though. If you're truly over, keep it strictly acquaintances. No old storytelling times and such. The only reason for this is if you want to talk to him again. If he has a new GF and she sees you, then so what? That's their insecurity problem. If you're not talking to him now, then there's no need to then. If he crosses paths and asks, you can mention it, but it's not required. No, he might think you're a creep or something. And he might not even realize that you live there, at least for a while, if you don't tell him. Unless you want him to think you are still interested in him, absolutely not. The only way I personally would interpret that kind of news up front as, she's still interested. If you aren't, then don't let him know unless you two run into each other by accident. I'd say even if you don't send mixed signals, he might be confused that way. If you see him, then he'll know you are living in the same neighborhood. I would not. It might make it into a bigger deal than it actually is if you make a point of reaching out to him. Just let him know you've moved there if you run into him. I've lived in the same condo complex as my ex-husband for a year, and we only see each other when we make a plan to. I walk near his building frequently when walking my dogs and never see him. Aside from 3 times that we've passed each other in the car near the entrance, we've never run into each other unintentionally. Granted, he is more of a homebody, so he's not out and about in the complex much, but running into each other has just never been an issue. ETA. I wouldn't tell him. I live in the same apartment complex as my guy, and we didn't meet for 4 years. I'm still blown away by that. Honestly, I think I'd appreciate it, but it depends on the person. I feel like, especially if you left off on good terms, which it sounds like you did, can't hurt to send a short text. Don't feel the need to over-explain or justify your choice of neighborhood though. Doesn't really matter. If he sees you, he will know. If he doesn't see you, you will have made an unnecessary contact with him. It is none of his business where you live now, and if you tell him you are inviting him back into your life. If he sees you around, just say you live in the area. Seriously, don't invite the drama, just get on with your life. No, I do think the chances are that high. I live in a townhouse and have no idea who lives in the units right behind us. Lol, I think it's unlikely you will bump into each other, but if you do, just say hi and explain you now live close by. You're moving 2 blocks away from him, not in the same apartment, so I think you probably shouldn't have to tell him. If you feel him finding out on his own would be a ward, then avoid the block he lives. And if you and him bump into each other, say a grocery store, then you could use that moment to tell him. If you're friends, yes. If you don't speak, then it's totally pointless. I live in the same neighborhood with friends I've gone to high school with and never run into them that much.